Welcome back to this week's Parent Parsha series, Parshat Vayetze. I actually wanted to spend a little bit of a moment talking about something that's been on my mind this week, and that is mask wearing and COVID, and thinking about potentially how we off ramp, I guess is the right word, in some way that feels safe and manageable, and really taking a pause to think about a certain degree of honesty with ourselves about how the ways in which certain COVID behaviors play into our own sense of self, our own fears, our own anxieties, and its impact, most importantly, on our children. And I guess I'm thinking about it actually in the context of this week's Parsha a little bit. So we pick up this week's Parsha with Yaakov fleeing from Esav, and he arrives in Beit El. He arrives at Har HaMoriah. He puts himself down to sleep. He has a vision. And in this vision, the Torah tells us that Hashem appears to him, and he appears to him and he says, I am the God of Abraham and I am the God of Yitzchak. And Rashi, so poignantly and appropriately picks up and says, historically, Hashem does not refer himself as the God of Abraham or Yitzchak or Yaakov while the person is still alive. And we know that Yitzchak is still alive. He does not die until the end of this week's no, he dies later, actually after Rachel dies, and after the reunion with Esav and Yaakov happens. So we know that Yitzchak is very much alive. And yet here we have a situation where Hashem is referring himself to as the God of Abraham and the God of Yitzchak. And Rashi offers a solution to this. And he says that because Yitzchak never left his home, it was as if he was dead. It's like a very crazy concept to think about the fact that that Rashi is suggesting that in this case, I think he's connecting the fact that because Yitzchak was so impaired that he wasn't able to engage in the world because of his blindness, based on another alternate opinion that Rashi gives, that he basically couldn't function, he couldn't leave his home. And therefore, because he couldn't leave his home, in many ways, he was dead. And it really got me thinking about this idea of being isolated and hiding ourselves. And I guess I was thinking about this a lot because Emily Oster, so anybody who I guess knows me knows that I'm a little bit of an Emily Oster guru. Look her up. She's amazing. Subscribe to her newsletter. She's thoughtful. She's intelligent. She's smart. She's an economist who has spent a lot of time actually creating a niche, I guess, network for herself about thinking about things that are very much out there as normative issues, particularly as it relates to parenting and children and health. She's taken on COVID in a very thoughtful, nuanced, science-based, research analyzed way. And her latest post on Monday was the impact of COVID and masks as it relates to kids. And it actually came at the same time that a Wall Street Journal article came my way about the fact that there seems to be some amount of evidence, and I use that term very loosely because I think we're still trying to understand all the pieces that go into play as it relates to implications for COVID and mental health, and we're still learning and we're still unfolding. One of the pieces that it was talking about is the fact that for people who have social anxiety, it's not necessarily that masks created social anxiety, it's that for people who have a certain degree of social anxiety, masks actually prove to be very comforting for them, and they fear the idea of having to take a mask off. And what Emily Oster talked about on the flip side was, are masks a detriment? And she kind of went through the research, and ultimately what the research kind of came out is that it doesn't seem to be that as it relates to kids who are, I would say, standard academic learners, shall we say, that overall those kids seem to be doing perfectly fine with masks because they have opportunities outside of the classroom that she's thinking about in terms of the mask mandate in schools, to have the mask off where they're able, specifically in playgrounds and at home, et cetera, where they're able to look at people's faces. But there is some concern, some worry that even though overall it seems to kind of shake out okay, that you're hiding a face, are we impacting a kid's ability to engage in learning how to read emotional cues and social cues, and language development is so much based on our ability to see somebody's mouth moving. Particularly for kids maybe who have a more difficult time reading, hearing implications. But overall, it seems to shake out that it doesn't seem, given the fact that we have other opportunities, that children have other opportunities in their day to be maskless. And so they're able to compensate. And that's an amazing thing, right? That kids can compensate, people can compensate. But I also think it's an opportunity for us to think about the ways in which some of our COVID behaviors basically impact and kind of are self-serving. We don't think about it in that way because nobody would wish this on themselves. Nobody would have wished the last couple of years on themselves. But I think that if we're actually taking a pause and trying to be thoughtful, which I think we do a lot here, thinking about the ways in which a return to quote unquote normal is not necessarily something that everybody wants, and really thinking about whether that's a good thing and how do we fight that? How do we push back against that natural instinct that we have, and how do we recognize that in our children? So for kids who maybe are scared to go back to having a maskless world where they have to feel like they're much more revealed, they're much more exposed, how do we help them manage that? How do we think about the fact that maybe somebody's anxiety around changing certain behaviors and habits is a reflection of maybe an anxiety around something that is maybe too much. I guess I want to just focus it right now on social anxiety because that's really what I'm thinking about, and emotional engagement, and really trying to think about as parents, how do we balance this, right? We worked so hard over the last many months trying to get our kids used to wearing masks and adhering to masks because we felt very strongly, and we still feel very strongly, that it is a way of minimizing disease spread. At the same time, there's a moment where we have to ask ourselves, is disease spread in this scenario actually a concern? And therefore, do I need to be wearing a mask? And then asking ourselves, is there a downside to wearing a mask? I think a lot of times people kind of were functioning from this perspective, like there's no downside to wearing a mask, so what's the big deal? And I think that in many ways, maybe that's true, but in many ways, maybe that's not true. Maybe there is a deficit. And I don't know that the research is capturing all of it right now. So I believe Emily Oster, and I think she's probably spot on. And I think that kids have been able to compensate. And I think that schools in general, actually, because they know that kids can compensate when they're given a balancing act of mask time and maskless time, or mask breaks, as they call them, that they're able to compensate for those moments. But I think also for us to be thinking about as parents, first of all, to be a little bit on heightened alert, right? When we see that our kids, that on the one hand, maybe we want to be like, you're such a good mask wearer. But at the same time, is there a piece of them that this is actually a protective factor and not necessarily a positive way? Is it something that is kind of being used as a coping mechanism, as a crutch to avoid something that's challenging for them that we want them to actually be able to confront and work through? We don't want our kids to be actually digging in around their social anxiety or around their anxiety and fears in general and holding on to something instead of actually being able to kind of break that down, because anxiety has the capacity to build on itself. And in some ways, wearing masks actually builds on that anxiety. And again, anxiety is good, right? If we're never anxious about anything, we're never motivated to do anything. If I'm not anxious about the test that's coming up, I probably am not going to study. But sometimes anxiety can go into overdrive. It can become so powerful, so overwhelming that it actually paralyzes us. And in that paralysis, doesn't allow us to engage in the world. And when we're not engaged in the world, it drives me back to Rashi's idea that we're somehow less present as a person, and our ability to be around other people, right? When we think about the idea of being locked in a home, or being somebody who can't engage with other people, right? So that is that's a sad moment, right? When we think about a certain amount of profound loneliness, profound inability to be around people. It's hard for us to think about, and one would want to think about all the moving pieces around Yitzchak. Was it that he couldn't engage with other people? Was it that he was scared to engage with other people after the Akeda? Whether it was that it was too overwhelming to him, this idea of his blindness. If you're blind, it's very hard to engage in the world and see, but it's also also that we don't know because we don't know these details of his life, but was he attempting to compensate for them? Was he not attempting to compensate for the fact that he had lost his eyesight? Was he too traumatized? It's a hard piece to kind of think about and try to wrap our heads around. And Yitzchak's so complicated, and there's so many pieces of him because we know aspects of him that were not isolated in his home following the Akeda, whether it's when we were introduced to him when Rivka comes back, he's in the field, whether it's his own migration, as we mentioned last week, to Be'er L'Chai and Hagar and Ishmael, right? So there are pieces of him, but it ultimately kind of Rashi's understanding is that something has happened to Yitzchak in this moment, whether it's because of the trauma that occurred to him with Yaakov and Esav and his feeling that he let his children down, and maybe he in some ways blames it on his eyesight, that he couldn't see, he couldn't understand the difference. He feels that it was his own deficit that allowed this treacherous behavior to happen, but in some ways he then isolates himself. He feels like he can't trust himself. He feels like he doesn't know what to do, and so he locks himself in his house and locks himself into his own world, and he removes himself. And when we remove ourselves from the game, then we're not able to be present. We're not able to actually work against and challenge our own challenges that we have that have the capacity for change. Just because somebody is feeling anxious about something, whether it's going to give a presentation. That was like, I guess one of the articles in the Wall Street Journal, somebody said like, I think I'm just going to give a presentation forever with a mask because I'm so anxious about being in public and people seeing my face, right? That was one of the examples that they gave. Instead of actually being able to think about the fact that like our faces tell so much of a wonderful story, that yes, on the one hand, when we see half of a face, we can still see so much about a person because eyes are a window into a soul, but at the same time, we're missing so much of a form of communication that's so critical and so important. And so we want to be really mindful about those things that maybe are more challenging for us or we feel more limited in. And yes, it's amazing to be able to compensate and think about all the ways in which kids have been resilient and they've been able to push through and they've been able to learn how to read and be able to make friends and be able to communicate and share. And I think it's all amazing. And so I'm not kind of getting on a soapbox and saying everything about masks is terrible and we should off ramp here and get rid of them because the children are suffering, because I believe that children are able to compensate. And I believe that the research is not 100% on this, but I also believe that we really want to be thinking mindfully and nuanced, and that we want to weigh mental health. We want to weigh and put our finger in some capacity on this story around mental health, around social anxiety, around anxiety in general, around fear, and really helping ourselves to think about the ways in which unintentionally perhaps our machmir perspective, which has a space and has a place, and it's important because COVID is dangerous and COVID kills people, and we want to save lives and we want to protect ourselves and we want to protect other people, and we have not just a personal obligation but a social obligation. I think at the same time we're trying to balance that and think about the fact that there is so much to a person, including their physical health and their mental health, and the two have to start working in tandem together. And I think everybody's struggling and working to try to figure that out. I think we haven't totally gotten there yet, and I think one of the ways we want to be thinking about is that our perspective of like it doesn't hurt might actually not necessarily be 100% correct, and that it has the capacity to hurt. And also the ways in which we as a parent or a grandparent or just a member of functioning society are able to get in there and say to our kid, you know what, you're outside and it's okay. Like it's good. Let's think about all the ways in which when you were at home with each other that we are able to interact based on how we can see each other's faces, and really thinking and identifying and trying to be aware to pick up if we see that our child is struggling with a certain piece, whether it's going back to school, whether it's going back to shul, whether it's going back to meals, whatever it is that we're returning to, and it feels like there's a hesitancy there, not necessarily that we have to push it, but more that we have to pay attention to it and we have to respect it, and we have to wonder what's at play and wonder if there are opportunities for interventions that are very small, very nuanced, very detailed to help our kids reacclimate, whether it's just kind of going more to the park where that you're outside and kids are running around and it's not a sustained contact, and just kind of thinking about the ways in which we can try to re-engage in society, and being mindful that not every every aspect is not a big deal. And also being able to put a weight of importance on social and emotional health and development with the recognition that it's not completely damaging, but it's not completely healthy either. And we want to be present in society. We want our full selves to be present in society, to feel like we are alive and living and engaging in the challenge and being able to be successful on the other side. Parsha treats. So I think you could do everything that with ladders, right? So like you could do anything with mass now, because that's like a total Hamaven Yavin for this week's Parsha. You could do anything with a house, kind of being like locked in, but I also think there's a lot of fun things to do. I think I also was thinking about like mile high pie in terms of the fact that like the ladder went up very high, up to Shemayim. So I think there's a lot of creative challahs you can do, creative cakes you could do. Yaakov becomes a shepherd in this week's Parsha. There's the whole story with all the different sheep. So I think that's a fun place to do something. So I think there's a lot of fun activities that can be done in this week's Parsha. And I look forward to what everybody else is going to create. Have a great Shabbos and a great rest of the week.